Hello everyone, welcome again. I want to share with you some news stories about different topics. So let's get started. The first one is about these new Zircon hypersonic missiles that are going to be adopted by the Russia's Navy very soon. And apparently this was discussed in the latest this event that took place yesterday when it was the celebration of Russian Navy's Day. So they are mentioning some characteristics about these hypersonic Zircon cruise missiles. It's officially known as the 3M22 Zircon, and according to the specifications, it can travel at hypersonic speeds, effectively 11,000 kilometers per hour. So that's what is called Mach 9. And it is essentially an anti-ship cruise missile, but can be used both for naval and ground targets as the similar caliber missiles, but the difference for this is basically the fact that they can maneuver and that they are traveling very fast. And the first ship to carry the Zircon is said to be the Admiral Gorshkov, which is a missile frigate, and it will also be deployed on Russian submarines. But because it is compatible with what they use, the standard tube launchers can be fit in theory into any cruise missile vessel of the Russian Navy, which is a good thing. I think is good to not create problems for the existing systems, and is much more economical. It can travel as far as 1,500 kilometers. That's kind of the official specifications. It can be different because many of these things are considered classified, so that's the official range. So that's one of the tests that were done with this kind of missile. So yeah, good news for the Russian Navy. And I wanted to highlight some things that were revealed yesterday. So yesterday President Putin signed two documents. One of them is the Naval Doctrine, and the other one is the Ship Charter. So let's start first with the Naval Doctrine, and we're going to highlight what are the main things that they are saying. That the new Naval Doctrine reflects the change in geopolitical and military strategic situation in the world. So now Russia sees itself as a great naval power, which will extend power to the entire world's oceans and the Caspian Sea. And they are discussing several threats and challenges. We're not going to discuss most of those, but they highlight the fact that the main threats are the strategic course of the US to dominate in the world oceans and the encroachment of NATO military infrastructure toward the country's borders. And they plan to create a naval base which will provide opportunities for resupply, so it will officially extend the operational range of the Russian Navy. Probably more bases in the future, since they want to become a global navy instead of just a regional navy, so that will probably be necessary. And there are plans to construct a new shipbuilding facility in the Russia's Far East, and they are talking about creating large capacity vessels and maybe aircraft carriers. I don't think Russia needs aircraft carriers, but and especially because the latest developments in defense, missiles, coastal defense make them pretty useless. So I don't know how useful will be that idea. And they are going to be focusing also in developing some capabilities in the Arctic region. They say Russia recognizes the Arctic not only as an area for global economic competition, but from the military standpoint as well. And they want to develop the Northern Sea route to turn it into a safe, year-round and globally competitive Russian national shipping route, which is, of course, only recently that the Arctic can be navigated. Before it was only possible with icebreakers, of which Russia has a few. And they are trying to focus on different regions, including the Azov and Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, as well as the straits near the Kuril Island and the Baltic Sea. And what is the doctrine saying about the use of military force? Russia reserves the right to use military force to protect its maritime interests should all diplomatic options be exhausted. So that is so is much more than this what is involved, and a few things are addressing what they call the challenges of what Russia should focus to make their navy more capable. So we are not going to discuss that. Also, I found this article when they are mentioning that Putin, like I said, signed 2 documents. The second document, it was the ship's charter, Naval Ship Charter, and this was there was a comment from Admiral Vyacheslav Popov. He says that it was significant the fact that Putin signed it, because usually this is signed by the Ministry of Defense. So the fact that Putin signed it was intended as a message to make it an important event. And they also highlight this the fact that this year was the 326th anniversary of the Russian Navy, and they are going to also inaugurate, or they inaugurated, the nuclear submarine Belgorod, which is the first experimental carrier of underwater nuclear drones, which are called Poseidon. So more developments from the Russian Navy, and I want to quickly discuss what is the meaning of this ship charter. And the main thing, it says that this was the proposal that was submitted to the Congress of Russia, the State Duma, and they say that a new bill should raise the status of the ship charter to the level of other charters which are approved by presidential decree. The introduction of the document into the legal field will give ship commanders broader rights in decision making in a given situation in peacetime. So initially what they say is that when there are some particular situations that they say could lead to an international conflict, by law they are supposed to reach to the president or the foreign ministry to request instructions. So they are not initially allowed to do that. So this bill will give them more more freedom to decide on their own without requiring the intervention of the president or foreign minister. I'm going to another news. There is this recent developments in Kosovo. So I'm going to give you a few details. Kosovo is this republic that is self-proclaimed independent. Originally was part of Serbia, and all of these region, the countries in these regions were part of Yugoslavia. Then Yugoslavia broke apart, starting with Slovenia and all these countries from Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. But there was an intervention from NATO. It was considered at the time an illegal intervention because the United Nations didn't approve these interventions, so NATO acted unilaterally against in this conflict. So the main thing is that there are some conflicts now with this with the government of Kosovo. This republic, self-proclaimed independent republic, is only recognized mostly by most NATO countries and not much else. Not even the United Nations recognizes it. But they are kind of putting pressure on the Serbian population. It's important to highlight here that Kosovo is near Albania, so there is a majority of Albanians living in Kosovo, so that's the ethnic composition, and there is a Serbian minority. The Serbian minority used to be more numerous, but after the conflict a lot of Serbians were forced out of Kosovo. And recently, the most recent event is that the Prime Minister of Kosovo decided that they were going to start some police operation, and they wanted to confiscate Serbian license plates and identification documents, which I will guess will be illegal, but because essentially, officially, Kosovo is still part of Serbia. So there are some treaties around this, but officially Kosovo is basically Serbia. So this is some kind of provocation from the Prime Minister, which name is Albin Kurti. And this is a declaration from Serbian president. He says the Pristina authorities are trying to exploit their current situation in the world to initiate a conflict while painting itself as a victim. So, if you know, Kosovo was occupied by NATO in 1999 after a 78-day air war against Yugoslavia. It was still Yugoslavia. And the ethnic Albanian government in Pristina is the capital, declared independence in 2008 with US backing, but has not been recognized by Serbia, Russia, China, or the United Nations as a whole. So there it is. Pristina is the main city. Here, you can see it here. Pristina is in Russian. So they have a lot of sympathy, Serbians, with Russia. And at the point of this conflict, there were even Russian troops in Serbia, in Kosovo, and this almost escalated into a war between NATO and Russia at the time. It didn't happen for some interesting circumstances, which I'm not going to mention, but it's an interesting story. Anyway, what I wanted to say is about the background of the intervention, NATO's intervention in Kosovo. I found this very interesting article, which is a paper that is analyzing different sources, trying to analyze what was the legal basis for this, because NATO was claiming that the intervention was necessary, but the author of this paper is saying that there were some failures in the way that it was implemented. They say NATO, as the force against Yugoslavia, was carried out by a collective of states once the concerned states failed to receive authorization for intervention by the United Nations Security Council and therefore acted outside of the realm of the traditional international law. And they say that it was out of humanitarianism. No? That was the kind of justification. So they say that there are some principles like gest ad bellum, which means that the only cause for pursuing an act of war is self-defense. Initially, that's the main principle. So he just quoting different authors about this, and he says about Walzer, he says that he believes that state sovereignty can be violated to assist secessionist movements which truly represent the political community, counterbalance prior interventions during civil wars, to rescue innocent civilians from the threat of enslavement or massacre by the state. So this was the justification used by NATO to intervene in Kosovo, but there were some failures in how this was implemented, as we will mention here. It's a very interesting article. You can read it to understand more about this. By the main thing that they say that there's the expectation that there should be expectation of success. So they say acts that qualify for communitarians as presenting an obligation to intervene include genocide, ethnic cleansing, and grave human rights abuses of which the population cannot defend themselves. And let's continue here. There is this thing that is called the doctrine of double effects. Under the doctrine of double effect, civilian deaths can be considered just, even if expected, as long as they were unintended. And they say that these principles were not maintained as NATO claims. And the main thing is that there's supposed to be the intention to reduce human suffering, and this should be a prominent motive for intervening. It is unrealistic to expect morally pure motives, they say. However, in the case of Kosovo, NATO's motivations were primarily material and selfish, and they say Johnston goes so far as to accuse the United States of selectively using the humanitarian crisis to assert their influence over Europe and consolidate NATO's regional dominance, which is easier for Western powers to legitimize in the case of a so-called rogue state. So they start to use all these adjectives for the leader of Yugoslavia at the time, which was considered an authoritarian regime. So they start to say it's an authoritarian regime, and they call it a rogue state, and that gives them kind of the justification to intervene. So why was there was no pure intentions? They are criticizing this because they say that there was NATO's lack of action in defense of the Kurdish or East Timorese human rights from abuse by the Turkish and Indonesian states, which were occurring simultaneously to this operation that was called Operation Allied Force. So this is an evidence of the selectivity of the West's moral conscience. And there was a question from Serbians at the time. They say why NATO had acted over Kosovo when nothing had been done to stop the Croatian government's ethnic cleansing of Serbians from the Krajina in 1995. So the Yugoslavia when it broke away in different republics, it was very violent. There were a lot of conflicts, armed conflicts, and this was one of those that they're claiming that there was no intervention, so basically they allowed it to happen. But the main thing is that because the Serbians have sympathy with Russia, that's why they were a target. That is kind of the basic argument for this. So that's why they didn't intervene with Croatia to defend the Serbians. And they say for humanitarian intervention, the lack of humanitarianism at the heart of the decision could endanger civilian lives. Additionally, the lack of coherence when NATO has made moral judgments to intervene or not adds to the suspicion that humanitarianism was not the primary motive for military action in Kosovo. And they also mentioned this, that there was a failure. NATO was failing to use proportional means. Despite NATO's statements declaring their intention to minimize civilian casualties, the use of strategic bombing campaigns seriously challenges this rhetoric. The majority of NATO's bombs and missiles struck Serbia proper and its infrastructure, not the Serbian military, paramilitary, and police in Kosovo, and accuses NATO of intentionally targeting electricity supplies to provoke civilian misery, hopefully pressuring Milosevic into surrendering to NATO's terms. So you see, this is the way that NATO and in general the United States conducts war. This is actually a violation of all the principles of war, but in this case they are violating what they call proportional means. So they say civilian well-being was intentionally targeted, detracting from the moral legitimacy of the intervention. So going back to the map, what they happened is that they were attacking Serbia. So they were not attacking in Kosovo, where the conflict was taking place. See, so that's the main argument. They say the number of civilian deaths and the mass displacement of both Albanian and Serb Kosovars, which occurred as a result of the bombing campaign, also makes it harder to label the intervention as just. And like they say, many of the Serbians displaced from Kosovo never returned to their homes in the region, which means that NATO is responsible in part for the permanent removal of Kosovo's Serb population. And there are some stories that after the Serbians left, the people from Kosovo were burning entire cities or villages to the ground so that the Serbians will not return. So that's kind of the kind of things that were happening. And they mention if the condition of proportionality states that an action must do more good than harm, it clearly cannot apply in the case of Kosovo. NATO commanders were fully aware of the probable consequences of using a bombing campaign, and yet still chose not to use a less risky land invasion, as remote warfare posed fewer risks for NATO troops and therefore reduced the chances of domestic casualties. So the main thing is, like, if the army is going to intervene and they are going to put soldiers, infantry going directly. The infantry has more precision in its operations, so can act reducing harm to civilians, while bombs, they are more indiscriminate. They just explode and they will kill everyone who is in the radius of the bomb. That's what they are saying basically. So they say that it's not a possible moral position to do this because they were caring more about the risk of their troops than the harm that was made for the civilian population. And they mention again the fact that they weren't even following authority. They did this unilaterally. They didn't have the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. So it is. This is the summary of this article that is very interesting, and I will read you a little bit of the conclusion. He says, to conclude, NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999 was welcomed by many for addressing the plight of Kosovar Albanians and is deemed successful by many Western states. However, this essay has critically examined the justifications given to defend the intervention and apply principles of jus ad humanitarianism and jus ad bellum to question whether in fact Operation Allied Force was as just as NATO would have us believe. Although there was undoubtedly a humanitarian crisis, the methods chosen by NATO to solve this were highly flawed and did not meet the criteria of proportionality by doing more harm than good. NATO's decision to use remote bombing rather than land invasions endangered civilian populations, contributed to a mass exodus of refugees, and the selectivity of targeting the Yugoslavian rather than Turkey or Indonesia further questions NATO's moral judgment. Therefore, NATO's intervention in Kosovo was not a just intervention, and the contribution that this intervention has made to the developing norm or responsibility to protect is highly concerning. So that is giving you a feedback of how things happen, because this recent event, it seems like is going to start a conflict again. Maybe Russia will intervene again. So this is again another possible flashing point for tensions in the region of Europe. So that's all I wanted to say. Let me know what you think about it. And as always, I want to remind you of the opportunity to support my work as content creator. In the description of every episode, I include information about different platforms you can use to support my work with donations if you want to. You can also support me by liking, sharing this episode in social media, and subscribing. I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you for watching.